Yeah, so let us start today's revision of articles of the editorials from main's perspective. So the first article is about women's safety and gender equality. So this is an issue directly appearing in GS1 women issue and also essay. The women's safety has been a lot of concern because of increasing rape incidents. So women's safety and gender equality, the key points here from this article are crimes against women have been rising, but at the same time conviction rate is declining. So this is a key point to be noted, that crimes are increasing but the conviction rate is declining. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs in its recent report expressed concern over abysmally low conviction rate in crimes against women and children, and expressed the view that it shows a serious mismatch between the measures adopted and their implementation. Right, so there are certain measures adopted, and there are certain implementation gaps. So the committee observed that the stringent provisions in the law, see, almost if you see, the laws are very stringent in our context. The stringent provisions of the law have not acted as deterrents in preventing crimes against women and children, and have had a very limited impact. So this you must always note that there is stringent provision in the law, and despite having such a stringent provision, this does not act as a deterrent. So this clearly establishes the connection that deterrence and the deterrence effect is not working here clearly, because the more the deterrence, the more the stringency, but the crimes are also becoming more and more heinous. So in that sense, this point should be analyzed, and the deterrence point can be taken off the books. The committee also flagged its concerns over the failure to operationalize all sanctioned fast track courts for speedy disposal for pending cases of crimes against women and children. So the committee, in this context, it highlighted this issue of fast tracking courts, because we read that conviction rate has declined, right? So this point is there, and then 14th Finance Commission also had approved for the establishment of 18,800 fast track courts for 5 years in case of heinous crimes. So, but that has also not been established. Recruiting more women. So, what we have to see generally is that in a society, in a patriarchal society, women tend to underreport things or incidents. Only when such heinous incidents happen, they tend to be reported in the media and such things, and it becomes a national outcry. But recruiting more women in the police force, what will happen? This has a multiplier effect in that it is critical to instilling confidence against women and children to report even in every incident of crime, okay, without hesitation and apprehension. So we must have an ecosystem where the army or the police station is gender neutral in that sense. In the absence of a desired ecosystem of the police stations, many crimes against women and children going unreported, which allows perpetrators to repeat such offenses. So that is the thing, because there's no deterrence, they feel that they can get away from the law, there's no poor conviction. So all these factors compound things, and in the absence of such ecosystem, the police stations, many crimes against women often go underreported, which allows the perpetrators to repeat such mistakes. So this gives scope to repeat such mistakes. And we also know that there's a national database of sexual offenders which has already crossed 1 million, and in terms of the sexual offenders, not just against the same victim but also target other vulnerable women and children, right? So Parliamentary Standing Committee, it pointed out that the heinous crimes that are still taking place against women and children, what does it indicate? It indicates that contemporary society which we are living in is seriously lacking to qualify the litmus test of any civil society. Okay, is to see how well educated, well protected, adequately respected its women are. So it is no these incidents, this they indicate that the contemporary society is seriously lacking to qualify the litmus test of any civil society, to see how educated, how well educated, how protected and adequately respected its women are, is also a caution against delinking crimes against women from the issues of gender equality. So this was the first issue, talking broadly about women's safety, gender equality from perspective. Here, largely they're talking about conviction, talking about the court perspective, talking about the ecosystem in the police stations. So this is one dimension which we can keep in point. Next, moving on, it's about next issue is about the creamy layer concept and the reservation thing, reservation creamy layer related. So here the key points are, the Supreme Court is quite correctly, it has recently said that income alone cannot satisfactorily determine the social status of a person, right? So income alone cannot indicate how, the social status of a person. So this is very important, that income alone cannot indicate the social status of a person. We often think that we often associate income with the social status, but it's not income alone, right? This point has to be kept in mind. The relatively advantaged could be, see, how can you identify the relatively advanced section of society, right? So of course income is one such thing. Apart from income, there's a wealth thing, wealth which they have inherited from the past. So wealth, no, it's again a historical thing which they have inherited from generations because of some privileges. And then educational entitlement, education is one of the important criteria to identify how relatively advantaged community is, educational attainment, political influence, whether they have certain political representation, policies being made for such specific sections, right? So this is one thing, political influence. And then economic power. Economic power is different in terms of having business classes from their own community, how the community is prospering in terms of business on such things, economic power, and social mobility. The social mobility of the community will be very high. These are the indicators of relatively advanced how can you measure the social status. It can be in terms of income, it can be in terms of economic power, it can be in terms of political influence, it can be in terms of educational attainment, right? So income, don't just see income, see income, wealth, educational attainment, political influence, economic power, and social mobility. So Supreme Court has quite correctly indicated that income alone cannot satisfactorily determine the social status of a person. Need to further the special opportunities in the forms of reservation. That's why reservation came in the first place. That income alone cannot be there. We are trying to increase the social mobility to reservation, imbibing into the government, giving them more power, and giving them reservation in education and jobs, especially government jobs. But now today, government jobs is declining, so reservation call is increasing for the private jobs, right? So we need to further special responsibilities in the form of reservation. The real problem lies elsewhere. So what is the real problem? The real problem is talking about how does one accurately identify? Now we know that there's a criteria to be identified, but how will you identify? How can you accurately measure wealth? For example, how can you measure income from various sources? Educational attainment in terms of what today a degree means nothing, right? In terms of skill, in terms of abilities, intelligence, and human capital. These are the areas in which we have to look into it. And if these could be even assume that even if you can measure these accurately, it would be a mammoth task together and process the relevant information in this context. In this context, gross income from all the sources. For example, you take income from all the sources and reporting, and it's obviously reported to a tax authority, right? This is one such thing which is easily observable on the surface level. This one thing is easily observable. The philosophy of reservation leading to better integration, right? The philosophy of reservation leading to better integration does not depend on the beneficiaries as much as it depends on the elites' willingness to induct new members into club of exclusive privilege. So always it's a two-sided game. We must see it from both the spectrum, both the ends. From a person who's seeking social mobility, who's seeking to better his livelihood, who is seeking empowerment, and from the other side, it should not be an act of charity where he's giving one time. It is for the ultimate upliftment of the society. We have to see our fellow brethren or brotherhood in a better position. That should be the view from both the sides. The feeling of reservation leading to better integration does not depend on the beneficiaries. Okay, not only the beneficiaries, but it does also depends on the elites. The present elite section, are they willing to induct new members? Okay, into the exclusive privileges club. So this is about income and creamy layer thing. So second article, we're giving key insights about reservation topic. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. This was an important topic with respect to the corruption which is there in the society, and which also in a way peaked in the time of corona. So if you see the article, coronating graft in terms of pandemic. So this was the article, coronating graft in terms of pandemic. So just if you observe the title of the article, coronating graft in terms of pandemic. So how graft corruption reached greater heights in such a devastating pandemic where the entire humanity was clueless. We were made to board onto such a small virus, and we were all locked at home. And at the height of the peak of the pandemic, especially in the second wave, all the sections were affected. So this is a crucial, giving crucial insight about the topic of corruption. Okay, the coordinating graft in times of pandemic, government or laws aren't weak and unimaginative to bring down corruption. So if you see government or laws, again, like any other social issue, we have and plethora of laws for corruption also. They aren't weak and unimaginative to bring down corruption, right? For example, if we go back historically also, Kautilya mentioned that just like it is impossible not to taste a drop of honey that you would find at the edge of the tongue, it is impossible for a king's officer to not to eat up a bit of king's revenue. This was Kautilya's view on corruption, that corruption is inevitable. Essentially, it means that even as long as 300 BC, at that time, we were rampantly corrupt. And as a society, we exploited whatever individual power we had. So this was our view back then also. The famous political thinker had foreseen the situation, and he said that corruption was inevitable because ultimately it's human nature to exploit power, whatever individual power one gets. that had the potential to be exploited. So that's what Kautilya is trying to sell. The very human nature itself poses corruption. This is human nature. So this human nature, if you transform, right, that is where corruption problem maybe has a solution at. Okay, if you see, time and again, it was proven in our history. For example, how corruption impacted the history. If you go back in that direction, so kingdoms grew and fell from some strategic corruption of individuals who switch sides at critical times. We see, we always know that there are certain incidents of betrayal. For example, the Great Battle of Plassey is famously known as its Battle of Betrayal. It was more a betrayal than a battle. If you see Battle of Plassey in that context, right? And then even the British East India Company. How could a company of such a small island rule over the entire country? It was because we were pliable. They walked over the subcontinent and established the rule of the Britain over us because we could be corrupted easily, and it was so effortless to divide us. So that was the nature of British. And in all these 2500 years, we have had several types of governments ruling over us. We had kingdoms in the earlier thing, we had monarchies, we had dynasties, and then we had sultanates, we had foreign invasion, and we had colonization over the country for 200 years, which sucked us like a leech. And then we had democracies. So even despite establishing becoming a democracy after full-fledged democracy, no country can claim that there's no corruption, even be the oldest democracy or be the largest democracy like us. So why is that government cannot absolutely wipe out corruption? So this is a key question which you can try to address, why governments cannot absolutely wipe out corruption. So because have not we punished people enough? If you see in that context also, if you see historically, punishment has been meted out, right? For example, the country has historically practiced capital punishment, dismemberment of limbs. Some of the brutal punishments have been given: dismemberment of limbs, there's jailing, there is public humiliation, there is seizure of property being done even today. All kinds of punishment of corruption over the centuries, right? Even the most brutal punishment, inhuman punishments have also been given for such an act. But yet, as a society, we are corrupt as we have been for thousands of years. At this point, we must closely observe. This essentially means that it is not the government or the law which is weak or unimaginative in bringing down corruption. Right? It's not about the government. Now we focus on government perspective. So it's not the government or law which is weak and unimaginative in bringing down corruption. It is just that as people, we are too strong and imaginative to remain corrupt by all means, right? So we are too strong and imaginative to remain corrupt by all means, and morally we do not attach shame or guilt in being corrupt. So this is a bigger thing that the corrupt people don't have that shame, right? This is where the concept of naming and shaming has been employed to some extent in the corrupt people who name them and shame them publicly. This is one line of thought which has been proposed, but still, there's no such attachment because they come out brazen openly again, right? So corruption is our blood, right? This is an irony which you can say that. Corruption is our blood rate. So during these testing times, we when a selfless and sincere approach during this testing time, for example, the COVID. Okay, now we'll enter to the COVID context and see what has happened in the COVID context. When a selfless and sincere approach was needed to fight COVID pandemic, this trait of corruption ruled the roost. So it happened that a pharmacist hoarded life saving. We saw pharmacists hoarding a life saving medicine. A and grocery shop owner fleeced corruption customers, citing shortage of supply. He did hoarding. He did hoarding so that he could benefit more. Basic equipment like pulse oximeter suddenly disappeared from stores, and if available was sold at a much higher price. Black marketing was happening. Even black marketing of oxygen cylinder was happening, and on families with dire need of oxygen at the time. And even when they needed oxygen, if you see, they were supplied with some duplicate item. Even a taxi driver would have charged hefty sums of from the passenger. Okay, we would just exploit any opportunity for money or material. That is how the material nature has impacted us. Now we would just exploit any opportunity. By stooping to this low, we have also defeated all the good works. This is one wing which is parallelly working, but at the same time there were others who were doing such a good work, from last section of society during these difficult times. You can recall the instance of langar being done by Sikh community, how he was given oxygen langars in whatever capacity they could do. So individuals, organizations, even political parties in their own capacities have been providing free food, medicines, ambulances, oxygen, all possible support to the needy, but they were easily eclipsed by the rampant corruption surrounding us. Right? They were easily overshadowed by such incidents, and we were able to see all the negative incidents surrounding us. See, in the COVID era, we have seen corruption that has reached zenith. Okay, this is just one phase of it, and what we must try to always remember that corruption thrives at junction of power. Where there is power, you can find corruption in that zone of power. There's a junction of power there, and then there is corruption which is thriving at that junction of power. And power need not be political or administrative; it can be of any other. Okay, we generally tend to think that power, it should be the higher level, or no, it can be at any level or anything which has power is attached to it. So ultimately, if you see that thing where power is attached, if we have certain strong checks and balances for that power, there are no incidents of corruption being getting down in that sense. And if the opportunity is not of critical nature, rendering the other one helpless, distressed, and the weak in some manner is easier to exploit the situation. Right. So this is one argument which we can always remember, that it thrives as a junction of power. In fact, corruption itself is defined as any abuse or misuse of power. So Corona has become a golden goose of benefits to the heartless, unscrupulous, and the ruthless. So the hospital beds were hoarded by unscrupulous agents in the connivance with hospitals. New reports of ambulance operators charging rupees 20,000 to 40,000 for ferrying patients for short distances of few kilometers describes as moral corruption in the most absolute terms. In our country, where private infrastructure accounts for nearly 62% of all of India's healthcare infrastructure, it is easier for corruption to thrive at every level of the system. See, in our country, private now most of the things privatized. If you can see that we are moving towards privatization in the era of LPG. So, in the hospitals where private infrastructure accounts for nearly 62% of all health infrastructure, it is easier for corruption to thrive at every level of the system. Patients and their families were cheated with fire extinguishers. They were given fire extinguishers in the name of oxygen cylinders. So that just when they needed oxygen to save their lives, they were being given with fire extinguishers. So the deep-rooted corruption in the health services goes as deep as kickbacks given to health workers to secure better services, theft of medical instruments and medicines from hospitals that are then sold at a very premium outside. So this is the nature in which the corruption operated in the COVID time. Before the COVID pandemic, who would have ever thought that corruption exists even in the crematorium ground, right? Even in the crematorium ground, there was corruption. Families of the deceased were charged up to 25,000 to 30,000 for cremating the bodies, which otherwise would have cost just 5,000 in normal days. Cremation was not such a costly affair. It was just 5,000. But now look at what happened, and because of this, many poor people who were not able to afford even this, the cremation, they threw their bodies in the Ganga. We could see images of dead bodies floating in the Ganges River. That's why the author is here trying to call corruption is a blood trade of people. The thing that was never effectively curtailed for centuries will only increase and occupy the center stage of our lives when people patronize it, benefit, and silently subscribe to it. So, in all the three, people are patronizing it. Corruption is being patronized by some people. That should end. And then some people are benefiting from it. The benefit should be cut off, because such a benefit is not a benefit. It's it's mere exploitation of other person. And some people larger in society are silently subscribing to it. These three dimensions, that some are patronizing it, some are benefiting from it, and some are silently subscribing to it. And this is a larger number, because here the society comes into picture. Effectively, when the high degree of honesty and morality of a prime minister itself failed to influence our society and prove that corruption was indeed our blood trade. So this point we can always remember, that Prime Minister famously remarked that मैं ना खाने दूंगा uh, ना खाऊंगा ना खाने दूंगा. This was the main statement given by Prime Minister. Governments can only help people's will to change, but if they do not want to change, there's no power that can pull us out of this intricate mess that we have created for ourselves. So it is we, as a society, which is less responsible than the government, is what we are trying to emphasize. Let us pledge not to exploit humanity with our greed. So greed is one critical value which is associated with corruption, and indeed, greed must be ended. Humanity must thrive. So this was about corruption, a very useful topic for the exam from the perspective of ethics, as well as from GS2. Also, why corruption in society was rampant in terms of COVID. So this we can, such arguments can be used. Let's moving on to the next thing. It's about Malabar Rebellion. Nothing much here. Try to revise the modern history. There's a static facts about it, Malabar Rebellion. But here the arguments given by Swami Vivekananda is very crucial. But Swami Vivekananda had described Kerala as a lunatic asylum. Swami Vivekananda used Kerala as a very derogatory sense after watching he saw casteism, he saw communalism prevalent in God's own country. Because of such reasons, Swami Vivekananda described Kerala as a lunatic asylum. Okay, that's the derogatory argument given by Swami Vivekananda for Kerala. Despite being a God's own country, this was argument given by Swami Vivekananda to Kerala. So this point was very important to be quoted. So empowering women in Indian military. See what has happened is, recently Supreme Court has allowed women to take up NDA exam, and recently we saw the permanent commission was given. Again, this is in line of women empowerment. Becoming jobs becoming more gender neutral and gender responsive. So in that context, if you can see women empowering women in Indian military, so just observe the arguments here. With the Supreme Court allowing women to take NDA exam, their induction gets closer to reality and will add value to military. We must not see women as a burden. We must see as them adding a value to the military. For example, indeed, women constitute 48% of population. This we all know that women constitute half of mankind, but their representation in military is just 0.56%. Such is a low level of percentage in the women in military. 1% in air force and 6% in navy. At least navy fares well compared to army and air force. It clearly it all these things clearly reflect a patriarchal mindset by clearly patriarchal mindset embedded over the past few decades. What has happened is, uh, see the nature of warfare. Given that we live in a nuclear armed neighborhood, the very nature of warfare has undergone a transformation. Warfare today is not what is to be earlier, and conflicts rarely cross the threshold into the no holds barred conventional war. Right? In such an environment, gray zone tactics or hybrid warfare is the norm, creating its own set of complications and challenges. So there's a gray zone tactics, there is hybrid warfare. This is a norm today, and here uh, the earlier kind of warfare never existed. So you can differentiate the nature of warfare being changing, and also the entry of women. Gender diversity within the military will give additional flexibility and options to surmount the challenges it faces, especially large urban setting. At this point, we must acknowledge that gender diversity can act as a boon in such a hybrid warfare situation, and we must tap it. Throughout our history, there have been innumerable women who have shown courage, resolve, and leadership in history. So, mark my words, history repeats again, and it will repeat. When it repeats strongly. So, we can see examples from our history where women have shown courage, resolve, and leadership. For example, Rani Abaka is one example, of Ullal, and then who defeated Portuguese in three major battles, and then along with that there is legendary Rani Lakshmi Bai, Rani Rudrama Devi of Warangal, and Rani Channamma of Kittur. Hundreds of women who served in the Rani Jhansi regiment of the Indian National Army. For example, even the vigilant leaders of Subhash Chandra Bose envisaged the women regiment. This itself shows a progressive attitude towards entry of women in the army, so who could fight shoulder to shoulder. This is one aspect of women empowerment in the military. So moving on to the next article, we can always go back to history and end our answer. Moving on, this is one way of concluding the answer is what I feel. So moving on, it's a historic move. See, Karnataka has become the first state to implement national education policy. Maybe we can go back and revise national education policy also, the key provisions of it. I think that would be an attachment to this. And then because we see national education policy in which envisages a tectonic shift in terms of curriculum, in terms of teaching, and also it envisages to impart education through one's mother tongue up to the class 5. Okay, class 5 envisages mother tongue. Tamil Nadu is the only state in India that does not have an Navodaya Vidyalaya because it clearly shuns the Hindi three language formula. That's the thing. Okay, national education policy should be revised from the exam perspective. GS2 education. Moving on, Madras High Court voiced southern states' concern. See, there's a critical argument developing in the respective population that Madras High Court voiced southern states' concern. See, southern states are relatively on the losing side in terms of representation in the Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha because they have effectively implemented the population or family control measures. So, Madras High Court voiced recently concerns of southern states. States' population growth, have declined as a result of its status success in implementing family welfare measures. Number of states Number of seats for a state in Lok Sabha is linked to its population, as there has to be an equivalence in the number of electors that the legislature represents. Right. So, because of this ratio, envisaged in Article 81 of the Constitution, to maintain that ratio based on population, there's representation being given. So states' population growth declined as a result of its success in implementing family welfare measures. Since the population has increased in the northern states faster than southern states because of the high total fertility ratio and other reasons, poverty and other backward reasons, so you can attribute to population in northern states, the foreigner will get higher representation of the house, right? Because of such a thing, there will be higher representation of the northern states compared to southern states. And we are also following the first past the post system. This makes the problem, even the numbers matter. This make the numbers game matter. So and delimitation was originally meant to take place after every census, but because of the differential rise in population, the population was rising differentially. So this it was decided to freeze the delimitation till 2026. The court noted that the changes in number of seats would increase or decrease the political power of states. But ultimately, it is a matter of election. We are living in a procedural democracy where election and all this mattered. So that's about that. It suggested that states facing the losing of political representation should be compensated either financially or with higher representation in the Rajya Sabha. So there's certain ways which it has suggested that if it is in Lok Sabha, make sure that you compensate them with increase in Rajya Sabha or to some financial benefit. This is one suggestion given, but you must see it must in any case be ensured that states have slowed down their population growth, do not suffer for that. And the United States that have slowed down their population growth do not suffer for that. Okay, this is a thing which we must observe. Then moving on to the next article, in this dimension, if you see the population, how it impacts the representation, even in the Lok Sabha, that dimension you must always remember that population growth, differential rate of population growth, having its impact on the power of the states, political power of the states. And numbers do matter in our democracy where we are following first past the post system. Moving on, this is an article about risks and rewards, the Hindu editorial on asset monetization scheme. So this asset monetization scheme recently was national monetization pipeline was launched by Ministry of Finance, basically to monetize the underutilized assets so that they could be in a better they could be put to better use such assets basically, and then you could make efficient use of it. So the risk and rewards on asset monetization scheme is what distinguishes this from the disinvestment policy. So what distinguishes it from a new public sector disinvestment policy is that the change of ownership is not invested. This is the first difference which you must note, that there's no change of ownership here in the national monetization pipeline. And this amount which they're getting, this could in turn help to fund the national infrastructure pipeline, where 100 lakh crore worth of new projects are initiated. But this is only for brownfield projects and not for greenfield projects. Private players will be asked to pay for operation and management rights and expected to modernize assets that are either languishing or are simply underutilized. So they're either languishing or simply underutilized. The private players so have to pay for the operation and management rights and expected to modernize assets. This is a plan for the national monetization pipeline. And how could this be done? For example, if you see InvITs was one structure that has already been used by, for example, Power Grid to raise funds against its transmission lines, networks, and could be used for highways, gas pipelines, and railway networks, including the dedicated freight corridor. So this was about how InvITs was used to fund it. Other way was the PPP model, for example, the ports, mines, railways, concession agreements, laying out the contours of a for a private-public partnership proposed. So, but when there is PPP, we must always be clear that the sharing of risk and rewards between the private and the public sectors need to be weighed in carefully for each sector. So, this point we must always remember that risk sharing and rewards should be carefully calibrated, and then there's a checks and balances. Checks and balances are needed for actual infrastructure usage versus projection at the time of bidding. So, this point we must always remember that checks and balances need to be for actual infrastructure. And just like disinvestment, you must always remember that just like disinvestment deals during the downturn could crowd out the new investment, disinvestment can potentially crowd out the new investment and risk the tag of fire sales. Fire sales where revenue projection for PPP assets could be deflated. Such fire sales could lead to lower bids by supernormal giants for the operation for the operator in future. So this point you must always keep in mind that national asset monetization scheme, it's always a step in the right direction that you monetize and generate revenue out of the assets which are either languishing or simply underutilized through mechanisms like InvITs or PPP. And you use this, but at the same time, the old apprehension that you're selling the family silver, that is no more existing, because the owner change of ownership is not envisaged. So this point we must always keep in mind, and risk sharing mechanisms have to be easily. And then moving on to the next article is about opening the schools. We all know that the COVID context, schools have been closed and many children are suffering from the learning outcomes. So, on opening the schools, you have to open the schools, but we have to focus also has to be on vaccination and imparting safe behavior. See, we all know that even adults are not able to behave properly and not following the COVID appropriate behavior, because of which you can see spike in COVID cases. What about children? Children are even more no less controllable in terms of all these behavioral practices. So prolonged school closures, this is we have to weigh both the sides. The prolonged school closures can create a crippling future prospect for millions of children. Are we looking at that such a situation where we have children of lost generations who are crippled because of their out of education or into deep poverty, and the evils attached to children such as child marriage, such as child labor, such as child trafficking? We're seeing such things which are happening. So this is one aspect of how we must look at opening schools, education, so child perspective. We go to the next thing. Next incident is about indoor test. Nothing much here. Attack on Muslim bangle seller in indoor hood is another example of Hindutva mob targeting a citizen for his religion in the pretext of protecting women. So the aspect of mob lynching, again, an example comes up where a Muslim bangle seller was attacked as communally insensitive incidents in Indore has happened. It's moving on. This is about drought. See, climate crisis. Recently, we know that IPCC is also report climate crisis. India now confronts a drought. So we all know that this is a thing. But just try to observe that drought like conditions are setting over most parts of as the monsoon recedes. We now see conditions of drought where monsoon have been deficit. We can see conditions of drought setting in over most parts of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Odisha. There is significant rain deficiency, and there is a standard precipitation index which is prepared by IMD. So it's an indicator or an index to monitor the droughts. So standard precipitation index. So apart from this, there is also drought early warning system that set over a fifth of India's land area, almost 21% of land under different degree of drought. It was very high for a country, especially when monsoon is just monsoon is just underway and still is either half or done, so 70%. So drought early warning system is a real-time drought monitoring platform maintained by IIT Gandhi Nagar. So this we all know that a drought early warning system is there, being monitored by IIT Gandhi Nagar. Unlike other natural hazards such as cyclones and floods, droughts often develop gradually over a long period of time. Okay, just we must remember that when you compare floods and droughts, the nature of the drought is different. This must always remember the drought has a long, set in time. It is called a gradual onset disaster in that sense, right? So unlike other natural hazards like cyclones and floods, droughts often develop gradually over a long period of time. They are creeping disasters in that sense because they creep over a long period of time and they impact. So latest IPCC report also said that South Asia monsoon has weakened in the second half of the century, in the 20th century, mainly on account of human activity. Anthropogenic reason is the main reason because of all these changes. And rising temperature could mean further, as the temperature rises, we can expect more droughts. That's why the concept of flash droughts also came in. So that's what about droughts. Gradual nature of droughts. So now there's a gradual nature of drought often prevents the government from recognizing its deep long-term socio-economic impact. Okay, often reducing the urgency that would otherwise trigger a timely and comprehensive response. So since this any incidents happen and we respond immediately, but this nature of drought is very since it's gradual, so government we don't recognize it as soon as possible, and since it sets in, it has a longer impact, long-term socio-economic impact, often reducing the urgency that would otherwise trigger a timely and comprehensive drought response. So expand the farm insurance net and ensure timely payouts, investment in greater adoption of. So what we have to do to counter drought, if you see the perspective for drought, what we have to do is we have to first make sure that the risk is minimized. Farmers have been given farm insurance net and timely payments are given to farmers. Timely compensation is important. This is the first part, okay, to just ensure that risk is a mitigation step. And then what we have to do to proof for drought proofing is to invest in greater adoption of micro irrigation techniques, so which are very water use efficient based, and introduced drought resistant crops. So drought is there. We must acknowledge that drought is inevitable, and we must plan our research and development in such that drought resistant crops are developed. So this is one aspect which we can look for. And droughts can further intensify farm distress. Already farmers' suicides are rising, and I've seen that. So further intensify farm distress. So lead to what would happen if there's greater farmer distress? We know that because of lack of shortage, and there would be further uh, exploitation of groundwater. There'll be over exploitation of groundwater, and it is not about only agriculture. We have to see it in a larger setting where agriculture being mainly rural phenomena. Any failure in agriculture would lead to it would lead to increased rural to urban migration. So it will lead to rural to urban migration, right? And it will intensify water conflicts between the states. So it would intensify water conflicts between states. Also, there's one interstate angle which you can see from the political context. In the political context, it is the interstate conflict which is taking place. Migration as a push factor which is operating. Resources getting depleted. Again, the resource part, and then uh, cities and industries. There's a competition between not only the uh, farmers and agriculture, even within sectoral competition. For example, there can be conflict of water between farms, between the cities. Cities also depend on water and industries. So this is where we can see we are seeing a potential conflict in water into future wars. So what we need is effective drought proofing. Management and monitoring is a need of the hour. This is a very important article about droughts. Okay, so let's move on. It's a direct syllabus topic. Need to revise it properly. So moving on, Kabul's twin agenda. Here in Kabul, we all know that Afghanistan, Taliban is taking captured power again. So India's twin agenda, what could it be? So immediate priorities. So what could be the immediate priority for India? This context is first we have to safely evacuate all Indian citizens and assistance to Afghans in distress and acknowledge the security and logistical challenges in doing so. This we must first do. This is the immediate priority. We should safely evacuate them. So that we must always remember that what is the immediate priority that must be addressed first. The first is immediate and safety of Indians to help Afghanistan. Other issue is the nature of new regime. It's the nature of new regime. We know that how oppressive Taliban regime was earlier, and especially in terms of get ready to open it ready for open engagement with Taliban. So there is no potentially a second terror sponsoring state. It's not sponsoring; it's openly a terror-driven state in that sense. So moving on, this is the last article about palm oil. We know that pushing for palm oil has become a new agenda because we import a hell lot of palm oil from other countries, and then there is acting as a pressure on import bill. Also, we are a diabetic capital in the world. So, palm oil, we have to develop some kind of self reliance in palm oil. It's part of greater Atmanirbhar Abhiyan. So, see, if you see the annual demand for edible oil in India, it's about 22 million tons, while the oil seeds production is only 7 million tons. So, just try to see there is a greater supply demand mismatch which is taking place in the edible oil. So there are apprehensions that a big corporation may lobby for changes in the land sealing laws to enable them to go for large-scale industrial plantations that rather than sourcing the raw material from farmers. So there's this apprehension of industrial scale plantations of palm oil. So regulations governing the national mission must be framed appropriately to avoid such exploitation. Right? And then 55% of the total edible oil import from 56% of total edible oil imports is palm oil. See, palm is dominating in terms of the edible oil imports which come from the palm, and then palm oil and its derivatives account for larger share among the vegetable oils. So palm oil and its derivatives account for the largest share among vegetable oils in the country. So this point also must note that palm oil of the edible is highest. Of the total, it's around 56%. Palm oil and its derivatives account for the largest share among the vegetable oils in the country. So oil palm is land use efficient, right? Oil palm is land use efficient and yielding 3 to 4 tons per hectare. So oil palm is land use efficient because the yield is more when compared to other oil seeds. It's 3 to 4 tons per hectare compared to just 1 ton per hectare of other oil seeds. Very high. where is 1 ton per hectare and 3 to 4 tons per hectare, almost 3 to 4 times the yield and subsequent farm income. Potential for doubling farmers' income also arises here, and then, but the point here is the agroclimatic conditions required for the growth of palm oil, that also has to be considered, because we have a special focus on areas such as Northeast and Andaman, which are suited for such agroclimatic condition, and these two also are to ecological sensitive regions, biodiversity hotspots in that sense. So, environmental safeguards, if put in place, and health, if it's also taken care, because of our consumption of oil and such things. So, then oil palm has a potential to transform the agricultural landscape. It has to potential to develop the larger neglected areas, mainstream areas such as the northeast, also, right? So environmental safeguards also have to be taken care. So moving on, this is a very important article from the oil palm perspective. Then the last one here today is removing the ambiguities. See what happened was, we know that politics converged with principle on the 127th constitutional amendment bill. We saw an unanimous convergence on this point, that all the political parties converge on this issue. This bill, 127th Constitutional Amendment Bill, it aims to bring greater socio-economic and political inclusivity. The 126th Constitutional Amendment Bill overturned the 102nd Constitutional Amendment, wherein Supreme Court had in 2018 empowered the President to notify socially and educationally backward classes after consultation with NCBC. So this had overturned that, and it has restored some power to the states also. Firstly, the powers provided to the states remain meaningless unless there is appropriate data. So now power is restored, fine, but what about the data? Who will identify the backward caste people? So this is the first point about data and pathways that the states will adopt to bring the law on ground. This also, how can this happen? There's a demand for growing caste census in the country. There's a persistent argument that caste census or caste-based identity will perpetuate the caste-based differentiation of the divide and rule, which is perpetuated by British. Caste data will create a wider gulf among the castes and communities. This is a in perspective. Caste is a reality in India, no doubt. Caste is a reality in India. We know this is a basic identity with which a person is born. So, lack of exact information about the composition and status of caste will only lead to ambiguity and hurdles in policy formulation and implementation. If we don't have such proper data and status of every caste, so this will lead to ambiguity and hurdles in policy formulation and implementation. Secondly, the lack of data serves as an opportunity for influential social castes. If there is absence of data, what happens is already who are in power, the elites, they will not be in a position to give up their power. And they will try to continue their influential social caste to tilt benefits arising out of the this amendment into their favor. So this is all thing. So lack of data acts in one sense as supportive to the elites, to continue the current, and it also acts as a limitation. Sir, we cannot bring in the targeted population. So lack of data has a two prong thing. So secondly, lack of data serves as an opportunity. Yeah, this is the thing. So two dimensions of lack of data we must also remember. Another congruent demand that is being raised is to lifting the ceiling. See, always we know that 50% ceiling was imposed by Supreme Court 1992 in Indira Sawhney judgment. So this 50% ceiling doesn't have any substantial basis if you see in that model, because 2006 itself, the Sachar Commission report had identified that at least three states, for example, Jharkhand 60%, Tamil Nadu 69%, Maharashtra 52%, had exceeded this reservation capping. So that's a social reality. So reservation had been instituted in India as a tool. See why we had reservation? We had reservation because we had to bring the backward and lagging communities, because of the historical injustice meted out to them, at par with the privileged class. So we reservation was initiated as a tool for equality, right? So affirmative action, that's what we call it. So this was a thing. Okay, so moving on to the you know, yeah, I think we are ending today's session here. So this.